see. This is Jeff Spittler, A Tale of Two Kingdoms, July 9th, 2000, Part 31. Okay, last time we covered how the General Assembly met in Glasgow in November of 1638, and how in that assembly they overthrew much or maybe almost all of the Episcopalian impositions on the church. Also how they the King's Commissioner attempted by fiat to end the General Assembly, but how they refused to be dismissed. And we also looked at how the struggle between Charles and the Scots finally came to blows in what was known as the First Bishops' War. How they finally came to a peace treaty, but one which was accompanied by a lot of verbal promises, else they would never have signed it. And these were never intended to be kept promises by Charles. And there's quite a bit of indication that Charles merely was stalling until he could restart the conflict. But in any case, this treaty set the stage for the Second Bishops' War. And I was looking through my library this week, and this book, British Battles, The Front Lines of History in Color Photographs, has a lot of photos of all these reenactments. And there is one about this, a battle in the Second Bishops' War, but they give a little background. I thought you might be interested in it. So this is the introduction here. Behind their shiny drums and pristine plumes, the king's newly raised army marched for Scotland. While the officers sat in their finely accoutred saddles and dreamed of glory, those further down the pecking order shambled through the spring mud and dreamed mostly of food. Most of the soldiers tramping north were uncertain why they were being set upon the Scots. No such doubts plagued the newly raised Scottish army of Covenanters. Under the leadership of Alexander Leslie, a veteran of other European wars, they were well provisioned, well drilled, and highly motivated in defense of their land and faith. On 2nd June, the Earl of Arundel, commander-in-chief of the English army, received word that the Scots were close by at Kelso. The English army marched at dawn the next day. Over the sound of marching feet and the clatter of hooves, the Earls of Holland and Newcastle could be heard loudly disputing who should have the honor of going first in line. This issue apparently took precedence over basic march discipline. By late afternoon, the English cavalry and infantry were so widely separated they could neither hear nor see each other. It was at this point that Holland, commanding the cavalry, became aware of something disturbing on his otherwise cloudless horizon. The Covenanters' army was closing in upon them in a large crescent formation. Holland halted to observe this phenomenon, and deciding that it was not to his liking, sent a messenger across to the Scots to request that they withdraw. The messenger returned with the counter-proposal that the English should retire, a suggestion reinforced by the rattle of musketry. Sensing a battle in the making, Holland about-faced and led his squadrons in ignominious flight, pursued by nothing more deadly than Scottish laughter. So, you see how God sometimes confuses the plans of the enemy? They're all worried about who is going to go first and so on. Anyways, there's some pictures in here you might want to take a look at later. Okay, well, that incident led the king to decide to sign a treaty. And so the treaty we talked about last week, afterwards the king remained in Berwick, and after the treaty was signed, he received Edinburgh Castle back, and he immediately began restocking with arms, ammunition, and provisions. And needless to say, this didn't make a great impression on the people of Edinburgh. They just signed this, quote, peace treaty, and he immediately started restocking the castle. On the 1st of July, which is now about a week and a half later, the Scottish Privy Council called a meeting of the General Assembly to be held on the 12th of August. I mean, this would have been with the terms of the treaties. They had to have meetings of the General Assembly. They also summoned, in addition to the commissioners, they summoned archbishops and bishops. And, of course, this is what the church had, one of the things they had refused to do in the last assembly. But it was part of the king's plan to pretend that the General Assembly of Glasgow had never happened. In other words, he had his commissioner order the meeting closed, and his commissioner left, and he acted as if, he wanted to act as if nothing happened after that. At the same time, he summoned 14 leaders of the Covenanters to meet him in Berwick, ostensibly to discuss his visit to Scotland, which would coincide with the General Assembly and the Parliament that was to follow. And whether or not this is what he actually planned is hard to say. There were some widespread fears that what he actually planned to do was basically create a trap, and when he got these guys here, he was going to imprison them and throw them into the Tower of London. Hard to say. That's not what happened. Only 6 of the 14 went. Some were apparently held back by force. Basically, people said, no, you can't go. So, just before they left, he had sent a paper accusing them already of 18 breaches of the Treaty of Berwick. And upon arriving there, they replied with 6 breaches that he had made. And along with the fact that they would have never agreed to the terms of the treaty if it hadn't been for his verbal promises, which he was already in the process of repudiating. So, as Mike might want me to draw an analogy today, it depends on what the meaning of is. Right? He got some other people basically to help, some of the English commissioners to help cover for him, say no, they didn't agree with what the Scots were saying about what had happened. Okay, well, in any case, he sent them back to get the other 8 leaders, but only 2 more came, and so he finally gave up on going to Scotland, figuring he wouldn't accomplish much. So instead he went to send back his commissioner, only this time Hamilton really didn't want to go. He told the king this story, which was something along the lines of, if he went, he would have to do things that would make him odious to the king or something like this. Charles apparently didn't feel this was too much of a slur on his personality or whatever. But so he sent Traquair this time, the Earl of Traquair, who had been his commissioner previously. And Charles, I discussed this before, but he had a propensity for sending sort of the wrong person. And maybe this is probably because he couldn't find anybody better, but he would often send people to do his bidding who were clearly didn't agree with it, what he wanted them to do. So now Traquair is just sort of I guess I'd call him a weak-willed individual. You'll see when he's with the Covenanters, he's very congenial. Then when he goes back to London, he sort of plays up the king's side. But he had been the king had imprisoned him for letting the Covenanters seize one of the king's houses. So he'd just gotten out of prison and being imprisoned by the king, and he was being sent to do his bidding. So, go figure, I don't know. Okay, the General Assembly met in Edinburgh starting on the 12th of August, 1639. I got this wrong in my notes. Okay, he'd given Traquair a list of directives. These included, he could accept lay elders in the General Assembly, but he couldn't accept them being allowed to vote in presbytery meetings to elect the commissioners to the Assembly. If absolutely necessary, he could accept the acts of the Glasgow Assembly, but he couldn't accept them as having been established by the Assembly. They had to be sort of brought up again and re-voted on, even though presumably the outcome would be the same. If the General Assembly was going to take some kind of stand against episcopacy, that was okay, as long as the basis for it was not that it was unlawful. Okay, if the basis was that it didn't agree with the Scottish situation, or possibly they didn't agree with the constitution of the Scottish Church, that might be accepted. But if it was unlawful, then the king couldn't accept that. I mean, presumably if it was unlawful for the Scots to have it, then it was also unlawful for the English to have it. And I believe the reason for this was that the king was also in a battle with the English Puritans, not a physical battle, but certainly many of his enemies in Parliament and so on were English Puritans, and if the Scots declared that the episcopacy was unlawful, and then Charles ratified it, that would give them ammunition in their fight. And then finally, this is a quote from Stevenson. Finally, at the end of the assembly, that was Traquair, was to protest that he had received his instructions from the king so recently that he had not been able to consult the king about them, and that some matters had arisen as to which he did not know the king's pleasure, and therefore that if he had consented to anything contrary to the king's service, the king should be allowed redress. In other words, the king would not be bound by anything that Traquair had conceded in his name. So how's that for a negotiating strategy? let's see. The king also wrote a letter. In the end, he told the bishops and archbishops not to go. He wrote a letter to the Archbishop of St. Andrews. Well, it's an interesting question. If he had told the archbishop to go, whether or not he would have gone. As you might recall, the public feeling against bishops and archbishops was pretty strong. So, but the letter, let's see, in this I quote from Charles's letter, "Though perhaps we may give way for the present to that which will be prejudicial both to the church and our own government, yet we shall not leave thinking in time how to remedy both." So, and he was willing to negotiate, but and give up certain things as part of negotiating, but there's no plan to accept that in the long term. Okay, so the General Assembly did defer to the king in some respect in that they didn't treat the Glasgow Assembly's acts as binding. They basically went back and passed in a slightly different form the same substance as they had passed in the Glasgow Assembly. They passed an act that gave the causes and remedies of the recent evils of the Kirk, and this was unanimously passed. It declared the Book of Common Prayer, the Book of Canons, the Book of Ordination, the Court of High Commission, episcopacy in terms of church government, and churchmen or bishops being in Parliament, all those things as being, first of all, the causes of the nation's troubles, against the Constitution of the Church of Scotland, and unlawful, despite what the king wanted. Okay, so you might think that this would cause the Earl of Trackware some heartburn, and perhaps it did. It certainly did later. But since he was so weak-willed, and he was placed in a difficult situation, he, quote, as Okies will say, he went along to get along. He subscribed the act with a disclaimer in the king's name that the act was against the king's inclinations, but he was nevertheless approving it in order to settle the troubles and give his subjects full satisfaction. So he definitely violated exactly what Charles had told him to do. Charles had also given him a directive that he could, prove the covenant as long as it was understood to be exactly the same as the 1581 covenant. So the Assembly passed an act which asked the Parliament to require all subjects to subscribe the National Covenant. And when it came to Traquair's opinion, he said that he could sign it with an explanatory declaration that would say that he understood it to be exactly the same as the 1581 King's Confession. But that was in his role as King's Commissioner. Personally, he would sign it separately for himself, just completely without any explanatory declaration. So, let's see. This met with the king's directive in terms of the letter, but clearly the king didn't mean that he was to agree. He was to agree to it being signed by anyone unless it was interpreted that way, and here he held it to be only him and acting as the king's commissioner. So, also he promised that the Parliament would, as its first agenda item, ratify all the acts of the General Assembly, which it turns out they did, but that's a story for a little bit later. Okay, they then moved on to they passed judgment on ministers in a number of disciplinary cases. To quote Hewison, it was for every conceivable scandal: carnality, drunkenness, manslaughter, robbing the poor, selling sacraments, sacrilege, fighting, disobedience, incompetence, reading the liturgy, and other faults, all indicating the looseness of discipline in the episcopal period. Okay, so they scheduled the next meeting of the General Assembly to be held in Aberdeen about a year later, in July of 1640, and then they adjourned on the 30th of August, 1639. The next day, Parliament began meeting. Right, and as you'll recall from, or you may not recall from our previous discussions, right, James particularly had come up with this method of adding bishops to the Parliament, so that not only did it have an impact on the church, but also had a profound impact on Parliament. And by the time, I think actually, I'm not sure when this started, but by the last couple of parliaments during Charles' time, the Parliament was rigged so that 8 bishops selected, let's see if I remember how this went, 8 nobles. 8 nobles selected 8 other bishops, and they selected some other representatives, and that formed the Lords of the Articles. Right? And the Lords of the Articles were this committee that wrote all the legislation. And then Parliament didn't have much debate, they just sort of voted things up or down. So by the time of Charles, by this time Charles had gotten the parliament rigged so that the 8 people he appointed picked all the people who wrote all the legislation. So, okay, so obviously that gave them quite a bit of power, the ability to write all the legislation, cast everything in their frame. And of course, when the church then voted that it was unlawful for the bishops to serve in Parliament, that left a void in the power structure, right? Because now we no longer had anybody to start picking the Lords of the Articles. So when Parliament met, that was the first issue, was to settle this. And they tried to settle it, and they had a couple different approaches. But so Trockware was really trying to maintain the king's prerogative. Essentially, he wanted, if it wasn't going to be 8 bishops, it would be the king would choose a committee of 8 or whatever to go choose the Lords of the Articles and so on. But let's see, I like this quote. Typically, Trockware had miscalculated. So he came down to a vote, he thought he had the votes, and he lost by 2 votes, so that the king did not retain the right to appoint the Lords of Articles. At that point, he pretty much lost control of the Parliament. They just went off and did a number of things. So in November, the king ordered him to suspend Parliament until June 1640. Okay, at which point, by then, he presumably thought that he would have reduced the Scots to obedience by military means. They refused to seize meeting on the order of the king's commissioner, but they basically honored the request. They protested, and then they stopped. But before they stopped, they turned their business over to a committee of estates and closed the Parliament. The funny thing is, this committee of estates kept meeting in the Parliament building. And when Trockware, he went to London when he came back, these guys are still, the guys he was trying to get rid of, they're still meeting. They said they're not the Parliament, but they're this committee of estates meeting now. So he had to eject them from the building. Okay, so during the Parliament, while the Parliament was meeting, Charles wrote this letter to Trockware. And just again to give you an idea of the sort of negotiations and so on that were going on, he complained Charles was exasperated, and he had, told Trockware that he had gone over what he was allowed to do. And so, quote, "Though you have power for giving way to the abolition of episcopacy as contrary to the constitutions of the Church of Scotland, yet you will not find either in your instructions or in any other direction since sent you that we have consented to declare the same unlawful. So we absolutely command you not to ratify the same in these terms in the Parliament, but only as contrary to the constitutions of that kirk." Okay, so he went on, "If you find that what we have commanded you to do is likely to cause a rupture, their impertinent motions give you a fair occasion to make it appear to the world that we have condescended to all matters which can be pretended to concern conscience and religion, and that now they aim at nothing but the overthrow of royal authority, contrary to all their professions, which we can neither with honor nor safety suffer. And therefore we hope and expect that if a rupture happen, you will make this appear to be the cause thereof, and not religion, which you know not only to be true, but must see it will be of great advantage to us, and therefore must be seriously intended by you." So if there was going to be some major rupture, it was to be over the monarch's authority, not over religion. Because if it was religion, it would look bad to the rest of the world. If it was over the monarch's authority, then Charles might just be seen to do what sort of what was proper for a monarch. Let's see. Okay, so Parliament was officially closed. Trockware was recalled to court. The king obviously was not very happy with him, but with an eye to improving his situation, when he got to London, he started telling stories about how dangerous the situation was in Scotland and so on. Of course, the worse that it looks, the better that, or I won't say the better he looks, but he doesn't look as bad. It was a really dangerous situation he was in. He managed somehow to produce a copy of a letter. It was allegedly sent by the Covenanters to the King of France. Supposedly during it was dated February of 1639, so supposedly it was sent during this First Bishops' War, the time leading up to the First Bishops' War, requesting aid. So Charles later used this letter. I guess the funny thing about it is that he interpreted certain phrases in French in the letter to mean things like that they were the Scots consider themselves subjects of the King of France and so on. But it was also pretty clear that the Covenanters didn't speak French very well, and parts of the letter didn't make any sense at all. And in fact, don't think that it was this. Certainly, this letter was never sent. So, although it is, I guess there is some evidence, or that they may have went ahead and sent somebody to ask the French king for aid. But what's that?
It wouldn't make any sense to government.
Well, it would make very little sense. Yeah, but so it's not really clear if it happened or not, and if it did happen, they certainly didn't receive any aid. So. Yeah, no, to go ask a popish king, no, I don't think so. Okay, well, the Covenanters again tried to negotiate directly with the king. They asked permission to meet with him. He agreed to meet with them, so they sent commissioners down to meet with him, and they first met with him on the 20th of February in 1640. Met with them several times during March. There was no real progress made. Finally, on the 11th of April, he had 4 of them arrested and thrown in the Tower. The reason for this was this letter. It was a treasonous letter. And so he sort of created a suitable crisis. And if you are a student of American politics, you'll see that things are often done by responding to a crisis. And that's what he tried to do, but it wasn't very successful. Okay, so there hadn't been a parliament for some time. I don't remember how long it's been. But when he called the parliament, he informed them of the necessity of invading Scotland, because even now the Covenanters were negotiating with foreign states, and they needed to do it this summer, and so on. He produced this letter, placing the sort of most dangerous interpretation of it possible. But unfortunately for Charles, the English Parliament refused to consider the issue at all until they'd settled their grievances, and they had a long list of them. So within about 3 weeks, they didn't get to his thing, and they just went on and on about their grievances. He finally dissolved the Parliament. So this was the so-called Short Parliament. Not only did they not vote the king any new money to support his war effort, they also demonstrated that they really didn't think the Scottish problem was all that serious. I mean, they just kind of ignored it and went on to their own concerns. So, despite the fact that he was turned down by Parliament, he was pushed forward to invade Scotland by 2 of his advisors. One was the Archbishop Laud, and the other was the Earl of Strafford, formerly the Viscount Wentworth, who'd been his, I guess, I'm not sure if his title was commissioner or what. He'd been sort of ruler over Ireland for Charles. And they pushed him to invade and assured him that it could all be done in a summer. And Strafford apparently got the Irish Parliament to give Charles some money. And so he proceeded on with his war plans. Okay, in the meantime, though, the Covenanters weren't ignoring the situation. Right? This is not as if this was some big secret. I mean, that he was trying to get Parliament to give him funds to go to war in Scotland, so they knew the story of what was going on. So they continued their military preparations, and many of them were, the similar sorts of things to what they'd done before the First Bishops' War. They did roll calls of the troops and training. They recommissioned officers, so some of their commissions had expired, and they basically hired them to stay on, and so on. And let's see, by May, they started some internal actions. They occupied Aberdeen again, so it would not become a royalist stronghold. There hadn't been any sort of any royalist or uprising in the Northeast, but they want to make sure it stayed that way. So let's see. So okay, they occupied Aberdeen again. Let's see. I mentioned that before that the king had ordered Trockware to suspend the Parliament. Well, actually, he ordered him to suspend it until, I think, June 2nd, 1640. So June came around, and the Parliament was scheduled to begin meeting again. So Trockware tried to postpone meeting of Parliament. The king wanted him to postpone it indefinitely. But they just went ahead and met anyways. In fact, they had a somewhat creative way of doing this, which I guess I've forgotten part of the story, but essentially the king had at different times given various orders that allowed certain people to act if this commissioner wasn't present. And basically through what you might call parliamentary means, they chose, there were 2 sort of conflicting sets of instructions, and they used the set that was most pleasing to them and went ahead and met. So this was truly a free parliament. They started by placing officially in the statute books the acts which they had passed last time. Right, so typically, if the parliament passed the acts, they would be ratified by the king. I haven't read anywhere that he didn't ratify them, but I'm sure he didn't, or pretty sure he didn't ratify them. So they went ahead and placed them in the statute books. They passed a tax to raise funds for the coming war. They confirmed the legality of the covenants. So there had been some previous parliamentary acts against citizens making bans and so on, agreements. They were held to be irrelevant. They passed a law against what's called lease making. It's lease like the word that we think of as a lease when you rent something. But it had previously been defined as basically sowing discord between the king and his subjects by way of slandering the king or the council. It was called lease making. I'm not sure how that relates to modern leases, but in any case, in that previously some of the Presbyterians had been accused of lease making in the years gone by. What the Parliament did was widen the definition to include sowing discord by giving bad counsel to the king. If you could say it was of slandering the church. But it's basically sowing discord with the king by giving him bad advice, telling him his subjects were, bad or whatever, and so on. And this sort of created I guess you could call it a general crime that a lot of the royalists would be guilty of. They finally formed a committee of estates, right? This so-called tables had been at a committee of estates that had been formed previously and somewhat informally. Now the Parliament formally established this committee of estates, and they were given the power basically to manage the country while Parliament wasn't in session, and specifically to manage the armies. So it was made up, let's see, there were 12 representatives each from the nobility, the lairds, gentry, and the burgesses, or representatives of the burghs or cities. Okay, that brings us right up to the brink of the Second Bishops' War. And actually, that's all I planned to do for today. So we have plenty of time for questions, discussion, so on. I think isn't he at his plow in England still at this point? That was the. I'm not sure if he was on the scene. I don't know if he was a member of Parliament or not, but he'd been a farmer. Right, so farmers make good generals. So, how was that? Vicky.
The beginning of the long Parliament session?
The next session of English Parliament will be the long Parliament. No, right. So we had the short Parliament. As we'll discuss next week, the Second Bishops' War creates a major problem for England. Besides costing about £1 million to run, they finally settled with the Scots paying them something like £850 a day for their trouble, and finally reached a settlement at £220,000 or something. And Charles couldn't borrow money, and he had to call Parliament. And when he called it, they stayed in session. They gave themselves prerogative to stay in session indefinitely, and that was the long Parliament. Mike.
Just in a more historical context, the Scots in this case were revolting because Charles essentially had not given them any representation, plus was taking and trying to put in another form of church government.
He had put in another form of church government.
Is that a legitimate reason to take and overthrow the monarch?
Well, yeah.
Think of in a biblical context, what line had Charles overran that all of a sudden now this was now a factor that causes him to be a legitimate revolt?
Yeah. Well, I guess I can't give you a complete answer, but let me give you a start on one. First of all, they would have considered their military actions to be primarily defensive in nature. In the end, they did end up crossing the Tweed, invading England, but it was clear the king was preparing to go to war. There was no question about that. It was no secret. So they considered it primarily defensive action. In terms of sort of civic resistance, I think the defining issue was the fact that king was essentially commanding them to do things that were sinful. And that's, I think, really where they drew the line. Well, like, worshiping, taking communion on their knees, and and having a church that's governed by bishops, and basically all the sort of impositions that the king had made on the church. Now I won't say that was the whole motivation. I think there were other motivations. I mean, the king was exasperating his entire kingdom, partly because he hadn't called a parliament and didn't have enough money. He did other things like sort of created new forms of taxes, shipped money to run the navy, and so on. And this was actually some of the grievances in England too. So there were other motivations, but I think in terms of the church, it was primarily this matter of being commanded to do things that were sinful. That was the primary issue.
Well, at this point, would it have been legal for the Orthodox Scottish Church to have abandoned the state church and start a new church?
I don't think so. I mean, was actually, if you recall, one of the issues was this private conventicles and so on. They actually had laws against, sort of independent church meetings.
So those laws are already in place.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I mean, it's not, that's one thing difficult to compare today to then, is the concept of sort of freedom of worship didn't really exist, well, maybe the concept existed, but it wasn't implemented anywhere. So people generally didn't think in terms of, like we might think today, well, what about just everybody having their own church, and so.
But eventually that's what they ended up doing.
Yeah, I guess you could say it was the final compromise. Right.
This is just following down that same vein. If Charles allowed them to start these churches that were non-state churches, biblically, could the Scots still fight against the king?
Well, I think they could have fought against the king. They were defending themselves. So,
they wouldn't have had it.
I don't think they would have the motivation.
Yeah, they wouldn't have had much more. It would have been difficult, I think, to come up with a biblical reason to do it.
Yeah.
Other than that, they would just.
I don't know if I mentioned that Alexander Henderson, the minister who had been the moderator of the First General Assembly, who, as an aside, they wanted him to be moderator of the Second Assembly. And he said no, it smelled too much like bishops, constant moderator, so he refused to be moderator again, and they elected David Dixon instead. He, on the eve of the First Bishops' War, he'd written a tract that gave the reasons why they were going to war, and they were, I don't know if I can tell you all the, give you a good list of the reasons, but maybe I can. But I know the last one was basically that they had to stand fast or they'd be turned into slaves. See if you give me a minute, I may be able to find the. Go ahead.
It appears that the Scots' reason for revolting against the king was much more grievous in our own revolution. Would you say?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, that seemed on the surface. So
there was a fair amount of opportunism that was played into our revolution. The English were stretched way too thin and couldn't really control it. So they were spoiling for a fight, basically, and they thought they could pull it off. And they did, barely, by the skin of their teeth. Especially when two-fifths of the so-called American population even supported it. Yeah, it was not popular. People did not feel, in general, they did not feel oppressed. They had to manufacture these tax on food. They had to manufacture the prices to get our revolution going. But then, once English soldiers showed up, then people did feel oppressed. So it was sort of.
Yeah. We've got a few minutes. Let me read to you a little bit of the summary of this document. And this is from David Stevenson, The Scottish Revolution, 1637 to 1644. I'll call him a secular historian. I don't know anything about his faith at all, if any, or whatever. But just he's writing from a secular viewpoint. Let's see. Speaking, the Covenanters had Alexander Henderson write this pamphlet, although he wrote it very quickly and against his inclinations, and he didn't want it. He didn't want it to go in general to press, but it was called Instructions for Defense of Arms, and it was apparently regarded later worth printing in England on the eve of their civil war to justify resistance to the king by Parliament. So to summarize this, he says the Covenanter's standpoint as outlined by Henderson undoubtedly undermined royal power, temporal as well as spiritual, thus convincing Charles of how right he had been all along in believing that this had been their intention from the start. In fact, it had rather been his insistence that this was their aim, and that therefore he could not compromise with them, that had eventually driven the Covenanters to adopt such a position of which few had dreamt 18 months before when the first riots against the prayer book had taken place. Most of Henderson's arguments are old, though in a new guise. The question at issue between the king and his kingdom is not, Henderson states, whether we should honor the king or render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, but whether honor should be given to evil and wicked superiors in an evil thing. Superiors, wicked and evil in themselves, should certainly be honored and obeyed. They might be sent by God as a punishment. Only if such evil superiors ordered evil things, contrary to God, might they be resisted. Indeed, they then must be resisted, since clearly when the orders of God and man conflict, God must be obeyed. In such circumstances, Henderson indicated that even private citizens have a right to resist, but added that it is far more justifiable if resistance is led by the inferior magistrates, those who have a natural part in ruling the kingdom. This was, he claimed, the situation in Scotland, where all, except for a few papists and their like, were standing to defence. Henderson proceeded to explain that there is a line in place of subordination wherein both magistrates and people are placed, a hierarchy from the ultimate superior God down through the chief magistrate and the various levels of inferior magistrates to the people. If the chief magistrate gives orders contrary to God, then he breaks this chain and goeth out of his order and line. In these circumstances, God became the immediate superior of the chief magistrate's subjects until the magistrate returned to his place in line. This assertion that the magistrate who steps out of the divine hierarchy in order of society, as it is assumed Charles had done, must be resisted is Henderson's main and most plausible argument, though he notes many more without explaining them, some general and some specific to the circumstances of 1639. The law of nature gives a right of self-defense. There is a mutual contract between king and people exemplified in the coronation oath. Scottish history and acts of Parliament ratify the authority of the states. The National Covenant binds its signatories to resistance in the circumstances. Moreover, claims Henderson, there is a difference between the king resident in the kingdom, opening his ears to both parties and rightly informed, and the king far from us in another kingdom, hearing the one party and misinformed by our adversaries. Henderson's paper well served its purpose, giving the Covenanters ammunition for use in arguing with opponents or the unconvinced, and helped many to accept resistance to the king, but most were probably won over not by his abstract arguments, but by the political realities noted in the last words of the paper. Except we stand fast to our liberty, we can look for nothing but miserable and perpetual slavery. There was no going back to the conditions of 2 years before, for unless the king was resisted, he would introduce changes in Scotland just as revolutionary as any of the Covenanters would make in order to assert his authority. And just to go a little bit further, you see the question Stevenson raises. Henderson ignored the most difficult question of all. Who was to judge what God's commands were and when the chief magistrate was out of line? The Covenanters assumed their own right, that of subjects and inferior magistrates. But even had the king accepted the line of order argument, he would never have admitted the right of subjects to judge, and was hardly likely ever to judge himself out of line. The problem was insoluble. It had arisen in the debates between Mary Queen of Scots and John Knox, and it had indeed been the basic problem in most 16th century political controversy. It was to be raised repeatedly by the king at the Treaty of Berwick in June 1639, and in other treaties with his English and Scottish subjects in the next 10 years. In practice, the only answer was to be that he had the power to impose his own interpretation was right. Don't necessarily agree with that, but anyways, he does sort of, I think, raise the issues that are of interest. So. And as interesting as that might be for discussion, we probably should stop there officially before we're descended upon by hordes of small children. Quick, man the defenses. General Edmondson, man the...
Yeah, I got to put the plow away.
Go put the plow away. Dan, would you close in prayer?
God, thank you for this time of death. Consider once again the history of the church, your providence, working your plan in history of Washington. We pray that you would give us wisdom and insight into your word and into the application of the lessons that we're learning here to our present situation. Again, that you might be honored and glorified in all of these. Jesus' name we pray.